Hi, class. Um, in this second part of this lecture on the large structural organization of the nervous system, we're going to continue our discussion of the peripheral nervous system. Previously, we had discussed the cranial nerves, the 12 cranial nerves, and ended by talking about the spinal nerves that are coming off of the spinal cord. You'll recall that there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves deriving their names from the different locations of the spinal column. For example, I had an injury in my lower back that was shooting down my leg, and it turned out I had a herniated disc at L4. That is the lumbar region, the the spinal nerve number 4 coming off. So you could actually predict which nerve is impacted based on a different part of your body that is being affected. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on. But now let's look a little bit more closely at the spinal cord itself and where those nerves are coming into and going out of. So again, we're still talking about the spinal nerves, or parts of the peripheral nervous system. If we were to look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, you can see that there are two regions of nerves that are coming into or out of this, the spinal cord. To orient us with this, we have the ventral area, which is towards the belly, which would be up here in this region, and the dorsal region, or towards the back here. And notice that coming into the spinal cord in the back, there's this little bulge here. That bulge tells us that there's something going on in this region, and we can use it as a marker. This little bulge in this nerve is the dorsal root ganglion. You'll recall earlier we talked about sensory neurons. Those sensory neurons were unipolar cells. They seem to have a single process, even though they included both dendrites and axons, but they had that cell body sticking up. What the dorsal root ganglion are all of those cell bodies popping up and making this bulge. So we know that this is a sensory input. And note that we're going into the back side, or the dorsal side. So this is the dorsal root ganglion. There's an organizational structure that's maintained throughout the nervous system where sensory information is processed in the dorsal area or further back, and motor processes are more anterior, more towards the front in the ventral side in the spinal cord. So sensory information is coming in through this sensory nerve, the cell bodies of which are in the dorsal root ganglion, before it finally enters into the spinal cord itself. That means that the ventral roots must be motor outputs. So the ventral roots are spinal nerves conveying motor signals out into the periphery. So just to reiterate that again, sensory inputs along sensory nerves are coming in through the dorsal roots, and this bulge here are the cell bodies of sensory neurons that make up part of the dorsal root ganglion. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies in the periphery. So this dorsal root ganglion indicates that this is sensory. The ventral roots are the motor nerve outputs. Now, let's make a little transition, because we can see it in this picture, to the central nervous system, but I want you to notice that there's this little butterfly-shaped area of the cross-section of the spinal cord. We can distinguish in the nervous system between two types of tissue based on the color. Gray matter is this darker area here, and white matter. If we were to look a little bit more closely at these, what we notice is white matter appears white, or at least lighter in color than the gray matter, because the white is the fatty myelinated axons of cells, of neurons. So what this means is the cell bodies are the gray matter, and all of the white matter are actually processes, the axon terminal, or axons, the myelinated axons. And we can see that in the brain as well. So anytime you see gray matter, you know you're talking about cell bodies. Anytime you see white matter, those are fibers of passage that are going out. Okay, to end our discussion about the peripheral nervous system, let's look at the autonomic nervous system, which is part of the peripheral nervous system. There's two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. There's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the peripheral nervous system does a number of things to help us maintain what's called homeostasis, or a balance. The sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is involved in fight or flight responses. It expends energy. And the autonomic nervous system, as we mentioned in the previous, are that part of the nervous system, that part of the peripheral nervous system that is outside of voluntary control. So we cannot control our heart rate when it starts to speed up. If we see some danger in our view, our heart rate is going to speed up, our blood pressure is going to increase, and all of that is going to be outside of our conscious control and mediated through the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system here on the left of this image is controlled through these nerve ganglions outside of the spinal cord itself, mainly in the thoracic and also lumbar sections. But you can see they send their nerves to specific organs. This superior cervical ganglion is an area outside of the spinal cord where there's direct projections from that to organs like the heart, the lungs, the pupils. The counterpart to the sympathetic nervous system is the parasympathetic nervous system. Now this is involved in things like rest and digest, where it conserves energy. You can see a lot of the nerves for the parasympathetic division are in the cranial nerves themselves, like the vagus nerve, for example, controls a lot of the parasympathetic, the parasympathetic expression, and also coming off of the sacral region of the spinal cord. Now notice, let's take the heart, for example. There are sympathetic connections to the heart, which accelerate the heart, and parasympathetic connections to the heart, which slow down the heart. And the question is, why does one increase and the other decrease the beating of the heart? And it's because these two different divisions of the autonomic nervous system use different neurotransmitters in order to control the particular organ functions. This sympathetic division secretes a particular type of neurotransmitter that will lead to an increase in heart rate, whereas the parasympathetic division on the same area of the heart will secrete a different neurotransmitter to slow down the heart rate. And we'll be talking about the specifics of that when we talk about neurotransmission. Now let's go to the central nervous system. If we look at a picture of the brain, put your two fists together with your thumbs facing you and curl your fingers so you're making two fists. That is roughly the size of your brain. You'll notice that there is a right and a left if your fists are still together, with a line dividing down the middle. So your brain too can be divided in half with a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. There are two hemispheres that are mainly mirror images. They're analogous to each other. But the cerebral cortex is that outermost portion of your brain, and it is distinguished by these convoluted layers of the brain. You can see that there's bulges and invaginations. Now those bulges have a specific name. They're called gyrus is a single one, or gyri. is the plural. So there's bulges or gyri, and then there's these invaginations, these fissures through them, which are called sulci. They're the indentations. And well beyond the scope of this class, each of those gyri and sulci have different names, but there are some that will really come into play and will identify the important ones. For example, there is a division, a sulcus, down the halfway through the brain, which is called the central sulcus. It divides the front part of the brain, called the frontal lobe, from the back part of the brain, called the parietal lobe. And this central sulcus has a major gyrus in front of it called the precentral gyrus. That's before the central gyrus, before the central sulcus, so the precentral gyrus, and that's actually a main motor area, and we'll talk about that at length. There's also the post-central gyrus, which is located on the gyrus behind the central sulcus, and then there's a main somatosensory or body sense area, and we'll talk more fully about that area. The four lobes of the brain include the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe in back, and the temporal lobe right around behind where your ear canals are. And each of these areas in general perform different types of functions that we'll describe later in this course. Just to reiterate those four lobes, the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. There are certain functions associated with each of those areas. So the frontal lobes, for example, have a lot of motor functions, and also kind of higher forms of cognition that we'll describe. Parietal lobes, somatosensory functions, and also a lot of kind of spatial reasoning. Temporal lobe is where you'll find your primary auditory cortex. The occipital lobe is where we find primary visual cortex. So vision in the occipital lobe, hearing in the temporal lobe. Parietal lobe is sensory, somatosensory cortex, and the frontal lobe contains the primary motor cortex. Let's look at some of these other divisions that we can see if we were to just look at the brain. There's some boundaries between these lobes. The Sylvian fissure is this long fissure here that divides the temporal lobe from both the frontal and the parietal lobes. That is an easy one to identify. The central sulcus, as I mentioned before, runs between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. If we have two hemispheres within our cerebral cortex, there are major bundles, major fibers that connect those two hemispheres together in an area called the corpus callosum. I'll show you a picture of that in a little bit. Other areas that I want you to know about are the post-central gyrus, which is this gyrus here. It's the location of the primary somatosensory cortex, or body sense, and the precentral gyrus, which is the location of the primary motor cortex. So it has motor functions. Here we're looking at a section of a human brain. Here's the right hemisphere, and here is the left hemisphere. Now, the longitudinal fissure is kind of that division between the left and the right, but connecting the hemispheres together is this fiber tract, and you can tell that it's white matter, so we know it's fibers of passage, but these fiber tracts are what we call the corpus callosum, the white body, or the massive body. So they're giant fibers of passage between the hemispheres. They allow the hemispheres to communicate with one another. You can also see the white matter and gray matter here. It's kind of this section here, this outermost part where you're going to find all of the cell bodies, and then they send their axons down to the various areas. There's also a fiber of passage here. This is your anterior commissure. And there's some other areas like the basal ganglia, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The cortex is also organized into what we call cortical columns, and there's 6 layers of cells of gray matter, and different things are ongoing in each of these different layers. What I would like us to know, not all the specifics, which is beyond the scope of this class, but to understand that there's an organization to the way that these cells are situated within the cortex that necessitates certain functional characteristics. So for example, when we talk about the sensory motor homunculi, there's cortical columns that are devoted to, let's say, sense perception of a particular area of the body, and it's able to do that because of this cortical organization. One of the major cell types within the cortex are these neurons called pyramidal cells, named because of their pyramid-like shape. They're prominent in layers 3 and 5. Cortical columns are organized groups of cells that go through all 6 layers and share some functional characteristics and information, they're information processing units. Okay, let's look at some of the subcortical structures. We've been looking at the cortex right now. So let's look at some subcortical structures that are important brain systems. The first brain system I want to highlight is this collection of subcortical structures called the basal ganglia. Now, the basal ganglia are involved in motor function, and there's a couple of different regions. There's the caudate, the putamen, the globus pallidus. This is an area that is greatly impacted both in addiction, where we're doing kind of habitual actions, motor actions, and they're also, the basal ganglia are affected in certain motor disorders like Parkinson's disease. You'll see motor impairments because of degeneration of regions of the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia play a prominent role in certain types of motor function, habitual behaviors, also unconscious types of behaviors. You're driving your car, for example, not really paying too much attention to all the motor actions that are occurring. Your basal ganglia are at play. But that system can be co-opted in habitual or chronic behaviors that are associated with, say, drug addiction, or they could be disrupted in certain disorders like Parkinson's disease. And we'll talk more about those a little bit further in this course. Another important brain system is called the limbic system, which involves a number of structures that I want to highlight that are important for kind of emotional processing and also kind of memory formation and associated functions. So the limbic system includes everything from the hippocampus, which is here in green, and this almond-shaped structure here in blue called the amygdala, which is involved in emotional valence. But other things, if you think about memories, one thing that we always tend to remember are certain smells. The olfactory bulb, which then leads into the brain, is part of that limbic system. So the olfactory bulb is involved in smell. That information is then sent into the brain. The cingulate cortex here in this area is also an area that's involved in some of these processes. Some associated regions I want to highlight is there's an egg-shaped group of nuclei in the brain called the thalamus. Now, the thalamus really acts as a relay center for incoming sensory information and outgoing motor information. So information will typically be processed through the thalamus before it reaches some cortical regions. And that's part of this larger system that we're talking about, the limbic region. Next to the thalamus, actually underneath, is called the hypothalamus, which is a region, a collection of nuclei that have a lot of hormonal functions and play a prominent role in things like the sleep-wake cycle, stress reaction, and things like that. What are some other regions that we can look at? If we were to slice the brain right down the middle, we're looking at a mid-sagittal view You can see there are a lot of different brain structures, but what I want to highlight here is there's the forebrain, which is what we have been talking about, the midbrain, which is just a little section here, and the hindbrain, which is part of this brainstem area. So let's look at some structures of the midbrain. They include the superior and inferior colliculi. These are two little bulges here. The superior colliculi is involved in visual processing, whereas the inferior colliculi is involved in auditory processing. Another midbrain motor structure is the substantia nigra. That's part of that basal ganglia. This is really the region where you see a degeneration of neurons that are associated with Parkinson's disease, but we can see the basal ganglia, or the substantia nigra, as part of the midbrain. And then some other areas like the reticular formation and the periaqueductal gray. The reticular formation is going to be involved in attention, sleep-wake cycles, arousal, a variety of different things. And that starts in the midbrain but kind of goes into the brainstem as well. And an area called the periaqueductal gray, which is, among other things, involved in pain perception. Let's take the brain and look at it underneath. So here we are looking up at the brain. You can see the temporal lobes here, the frontal lobes, the cerebellum, even the olfactory bulbs here. What I want to point out is the cerebellum, which is down here. It's that little brain, the cerebellum, little brain, little cortex in the back of your brain. It has a variety of functions, including motor, coordination, and control, but also a lot of cognitive functions as well that's being more explored recently. This bulge on the top of the brainstem is an area called the pons. The pons means the bridge. There's a variety of sensory and motor nuclei there. It also is where a lot of the cranial nerves emerge from. And then below that, right in this region here, is an area called the medulla. The medulla is really the seat of nuclei responsible for basic life processes. Here we're talking about respiration, the ability to breathe, heart rate, and those things. This is an area that also has a lot of opioid receptors, so individuals who take an overdose of an opioid, they have the potential to die from that, not because of a variety of reasons, but they usually end up not breathing because this area is depressed so much that those processes controlling breathing stop, and if you stop breathing, you die. Okay, that was a lot, but let's ask a couple of questions and we'll end this section. So question 2.2, transmission of information between neurons occur in the same way as transmission along an axon. Is that true or false? And 2.3, the somatic nervous system carries signals from the blank and is a part of the blank. So the somatic nervous system carries signals from the blank and is a part of the blank.